Jonathan Hayes had everything a man could ever want: money, power, influence. Yet, as he stepped out of his sleek black limousine onto the busy city street, none of it mattered. His mind was already occupied with the multi-million-dollar deal he was about to close, the headlines that would soon praise his business acumen, the legacy he was building. He barely noticed the sea of pedestrians moving around him, the honking of impatient taxi drivers, or the desperate hands of street beggars reaching out for spare change. To him, they were background noise, insignificant details in a world that revolved around success. But then something unexpected happened. A small, dirt-streaked hand grabbed his sleeve, stopping him mid-step. Jonathan's first instinct was to pull away, to shake off whoever dared to touch him. But when he looked down, he saw a boy, thin, ragged, no older than 10, gazing up at him with eyes far too intense for someone his age. There was something strangely piercing about them, something that sent an unsettling ripple through Jonathan's usually unshakable confidence. "Please, sir, just a moment," the boy said. His voice wasn't desperate like the other beggars Jonathan had encountered. It was calm, steady, almost knowing. Jonathan exhaled sharply, already annoyed. He didn't have time for this. "Kid, if you're looking for money, I don't carry cash." He pulled his arm back, expecting the boy to move on like the rest did when turned away, but the boy didn't budge. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice unwavering. "I need to talk to you." Jonathan's brows furrowed. That was new. Most street kids either begged or tried to pickpocket him, not engage him in conversation. He glanced at his watch. His time was far too valuable to be wasted on whatever game this kid was playing. "Listen, I have somewhere to be," he said impatiently. "Go ask someone else." The boy still didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Jonathan with a look that made him uneasy. "You don't remember me, do you?" Jonathan's irritation was quickly replaced by confusion. "What?" The boy sighed, as if he had expected this reaction. "Come with me," he said. "Not pleading, not begging. Telling." Jonathan scoffed. "That's not happening." But then the boy did something unexpected, something that made Jonathan's pulse quicken. He reached into the tattered pocket of his oversized hoodie and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Without a word, he held it up for Jonathan to see. Jonathan's breath hitched. The photo was old, faded at the edges, but the image was clear. It was of a younger him, standing next to a woman he had once loved and lost. His world tilted. His heart pounded. Who was this boy? And how did he have that picture? Jonathan's hands clenched as he stared at the worn photograph. It was impossible. That picture, that moment, belonged to a past he had buried long ago. He could still remember the day it was taken, back when he was just another ambitious young man trying to make something of himself. Back when he had loved Evelyn with all his heart. He hadn't seen that photo in years, yet here it was, held by a street beggar who looked him like he had all the answers in the world. He swallowed hard, tearing his gaze away from the picture. "Where did you get this?" His voice was sharp, controlled, but inside his chest was tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he slid the photo back into his pocket and turned toward the alleyway behind him. "Come with me," he said again, this time softer. Jonathan hesitated. Every rational part of him screamed to walk away. He had meetings to attend, business deals to finalize. He didn't chase ghosts from his past, and yet his feet felt frozen to the ground. The weight of the photograph lingered in his mind, a silent force pulling him toward the unknown. Against all logic, he took a deep breath and followed the boy. The alley was narrow, lined with old brick buildings covered in faded graffiti. Jonathan's expensive shoes clicked against the uneven pavement, completely out of place in this forgotten part of the city. He had spent years building a life far away from places like this, yet now he found himself willingly stepping into the shadows. The boy walked ahead of him, his small frame moving with a quiet confidence that didn't match his ragged appearance. Jonathan studied him, his sharp mind already working through possibilities. Was this some elaborate scam? A setup? But how could that be? The photograph, the specificity of it, made no sense. Finally, they reached a dead end where an old metal door stood rusting against the brick wall. The boy knocked twice. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room inside. Jonathan's heart pounded. A woman stepped forward, her silhouette framed by the weak light from within. Then she stepped closer. Jonathan felt the air rush from his lungs. It was her, Evelyn. Her face was thinner, older, but there was no mistaking those eyes. The same ones he had once sworn he would never forget. Her lips parted slightly in shock, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorframe to steady herself. "Jonathan," she whispered, as if saying his name confirmed he was really standing there. Jonathan felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had walked into that alley as a man in control, a billionaire with the world at his feet. But now, standing before the woman he had abandoned and the boy who had led him here, he realized, for the first time in years, he was the one who had no idea what came next. Jonathan felt his chest tighten as he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Evelyn. A million thoughts swirled in his mind, but none of them formed into words. How was she here? How would she come to live like this? And more importantly, why hadn't she told him? Evelyn swallowed hard, as if struggling to find her voice. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said softly. Her eyes flickered to the boy standing beside him. "But I guess fate had other plans." Jonathan finally turned to the child, his mind still reeling. "Who is he?" His voice came out rough, unsteady. He already knew the answer, he felt it, but some part of him refused to believe it until she confirmed it. Evelyn let out a slow breath. "His name is Daniel." Her gaze met his. "He's your son, Jonathan." The words hit him like a freight train. He staggered back a step, his breath caught in his throat. No, that's not possible. His mind rebelled against it, against the idea that for over a decade he had a son and never knew. He looked at the boy again, really looked at him, and suddenly the resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp jawline, the same deep-set eyes. Daniel held his stare, not flinching, not looking away. "You left before she could tell you," he said, his voice unreadable. "Before you became this." He motioned slightly toward Jonathan's expensive suit, his polished shoes, everything that symbolized his wealth. "I guess there was never room in your world for us." Jonathan felt something inside him crack. "That's not true," he said quickly, but even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure. Had he ever given Evelyn a second thought after he left? Back then he had been so blinded by his ambition, so obsessed with success, that everything else had become secondary. He had told himself it was for the best. He hadn't known what he was leaving behind. Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I tried to tell you," she said, "but you never answered my calls, and when I finally gave up, I realized I couldn't chase someone who didn't want to be caught." Her voice didn't hold anger, just quiet resignation, which somehow made it hurt even more. Jonathan's hands balled into fists. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. He had walked away from her, and in doing so he had walked away from his own child. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Jonathan turned to Daniel. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I had no idea you existed." Daniel shrugged, but there was something guarded in his expression. "I didn't bring you here for an apology," he said. "I just wanted you to see me." Jonathan's throat tightened. The boy wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for handouts. He had only wanted acknowledgement. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hayes, billionaire businessman and master of the world, felt completely powerless. Jonathan stood there, his world unraveling before him. He had spent years building his empire, creating a legacy that would make his name unforgettable. Yet, standing in that dimly lit room, facing the woman he once loved and the son he never knew he had, he realized something chilling. His name meant nothing to them. Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You have everything now, don't you?" she said, tilting her head slightly. "The money, the power, the reputation." Jonathan could hear the unspoken words. But what did it cost you? His throat felt tight. He had walked into this alleyway thinking he was in control, but the moment he laid eyes on his son, on Evelyn, everything he believed about himself shattered. He had always thought of himself as a man who made the right choices, the smart choices. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had he made the biggest mistake of his life? Daniel stood quietly, his arms tucked into the oversized hoodie that swallowed his small frame. He wasn't angry. He wasn't crying, and somehow that made it worse. Jonathan had expected resentment, yelling accusations, something to fight against. But Daniel just stared at him with those piercing eyes, waiting. Jonathan swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Evelyn let out a small, bitter laugh. Of course you don't. She turned away, walking further into the small apartment. Jonathan glanced around and felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. The place was small, barely furnished, the kind of home that showed struggle in every corner. Had she really been living like this all these years? Had his son grown up like this, while he sat in penthouse offices, drinking the finest scotch and making billion-dollar deals? Daniel finally broke the silence. I never wanted your money. His voice was calm, but firm. I just wanted to see the man my mother used to talk about. Jonathan flinched. And what did she say? Daniel shrugged. That you were smart, that you had big dreams, that you weren't ready to be a father. His eyes met Jonathan's again. She was right. Jonathan exhaled sharply. He felt like he had been punched in the gut. I didn't know, he said, his voice laced with frustration. If I had... Evelyn turned to him, her gaze sharp. If you had known, what? She challenged. Would you have come back? Or would you have convinced yourself, like you did back then, that success mattered more than anything? Jonathan wanted to argue, to tell her that of course he would have been there, but deep down he wasn't sure if that was true. The younger version of himself, the man who had been blinded by ambition, might have justified leaving anyway. And that realization burned. Silence stretched between them again. Jonathan had spoken in front of thousands, had closed deals that shaped industries, yet he had never felt so incapable of finding the right words. Finally, he took a step forward. I can't change the past, he admitted, but I want to be part of his future. He looked at Daniel. If you'll let me. Evelyn sighed, the hardness in her expression wavering for the first time. That's not a decision I can make for him, she said. Daniel studied Jonathan for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. Prove it. Jonathan knew, in that moment, that no amount of money could buy back the years he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, he had been given a second chance to earn something far more valuable. Jonathan had never felt uncertain about anything in his life. He was a man who made decisions with precision, who saw opportunities and seized them without hesitation. But standing in front of his son, he felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of failure in business, not fear of losing a deal, but fear of losing something he never even realized he had. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. Prove it. Jonathan cleared his throat, looking between the boy and Evelyn. I don't expect you to believe me overnight, he admitted, but I want to try. I want to be here now. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And what does that mean exactly? You're just going to walk in and play dad all of a sudden? Jonathan hesitated. I don't know how to be a father, he confessed, but I want to learn, if you'll let me. Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms. This isn't something you can just throw money at, Jonathan. I know. Daniel studied him for a moment before exhaling, shoving his hands in his hoodie pockets. You say you want to be here now, but what happens when you get a phone call, when your business needs you? His voice wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it, a challenge. People like you don't just pause their lives. Jonathan felt the weight of those words, and he knew Daniel was right. His entire life had been built on ruthless ambition, constant movement. He had never once stopped to consider anything beyond his next big achievement. But what was all that success worth if it meant losing the only family he had left? So, for the first time, he did something he never did. He made a decision without thinking about the consequences. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without hesitation, dialed his assistant. Cancel my meetings for the next 2 weeks, he said firmly. The assistant stammered on the other end, confused. Sir, you have a deal closing next. Cancel it, Jonathan repeated. Everything. And then, without waiting for a response, he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Evelyn's mouth parted slightly in shock. Even Daniel, who had been bracing himself for disappointment, looked surprised. Jonathan met his son's gaze. I don't have all the answers, he admitted, but I know one thing. No business deal is more important than this. He gestured between them. Than you. A long silence followed. Then, finally, Daniel smirked just slightly. Guess we'll see if you can handle real life instead of just boardrooms. Jonathan let out a small chuckle, relief washing over him. I guess we will. Evelyn sighed, but this time there was something softer in her expression. This doesn't fix everything, Jonathan. I know, he said, but it's a start. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes didn't feel like a billionaire, a businessman, or a man chasing success. For the first time, he just felt like a father trying to make things right.